and welcome to Wrongful, a podcast where we look at cases of potential wrongful convictions. Follow along as we introduce you to our first case, the trial of Zachariah Anderson. Hi, and welcome to Wrongful, Episode 5, Part 2, The Trial. In our last episode, we explored the first part of trial, some of the questionable testimony by witnesses, and coaching by the district attorney. We saw the dramatic testimony of Zach's daughter, where some of the allegations just didn't make sense. In our concluding episode, we'll continue exploring the remainder of the trial, more questionable tactics, and misrepresentation of evidence by the prosecution. Then finally, the verdict, along with the reactions and responses that followed. A big part of this case focused on the much lesser charges of stalking, but the prosecution possibly had the idea that if they could sell the jury on the notion that Zach was stalking Sadie and Rosalio, they could sell them on the intent for murder. Perhaps this motive could trump all the lack of evidence there was proving that Zach committed the murder. Basically, they needed to sell the motive of why Zach would have murdered Rosalio Gutierrez. This is something we've seen in a lot of documentaries. They spend a majority of time focusing on why Zach would want Rosalio out of the picture. They focus on a jealous and obsessed ex, but that carefully curated part of the trial is not the full story. In exploring this case, we found more evidence that Zach was moving on without Sadie. He was in a loving relationship with Christine and in the process of trying to get custody of his 3 children. So if that narrative countered that of what Sadie claimed, and the jury could believe that Zach was not what they claimed him to be, an obsessed ex-boyfriend, their murder charges would crumble. But the stalking charges in and of themselves were also weak. Mostly, they relied on the testimony of Sadie and O.A., Zach's daughter. But witness testimony on its own, without any evidence to corroborate it, is still pretty weak. The prosecution would have to introduce some kind of evidence they claim could prove Zach was stalking. When Sadie was on the stand giving her testimony about her knowledge of Zach and O.A. coming to her home while she was with Rosalio, the ADA would ask Sadie to review a video taken off Zach's phone. The video showed Sadie's home and was dated April 25th. The ADA asked Sadie to identify the rooms of the house and birthday party decorations seen in the footage. This footage would be found in Zach's phone and dated for April 25th. This evidence was supposed to show video evidence of Zach stalking her. But what they did not show during this testimony was the time that it was taken. Zach and O.A. had been at Sadie's house in the early morning hours of the 25th, approximately around 1 a.m., but the video they showed in court at Sadie's home was taken at 6:57 p.m. That would have been when Zach was at Sadie's home later for O.A.'s birthday party, an event that he had been invited to. The prosecution misrepresented the timing of this video to make it look like there was video evidence of Zach at Sadie's home recording during the time he and O.A. went there that early morning. This is just another example of how they manipulated the evidence to make it mean something it didn't mean. We would see this continue for the testimony of Detective Sean Morton, a forensic examiner with the Kenosha Police Department, who took the stand on day 10 to discuss his findings from Zach's MSI laptop found at his home. This process involved removing the hard drive and creating a forensic image, basically creating an exact copy of the laptop and then examining the data. Initially, he did a download and tagged a few pieces of interest and then turned it back over to detectives. But then, on May 26th, he was asked to do a more in-depth examination on the laptop. Here he came across a folder on the desktop labeled Kids, with a folder labeled Rosalio Gutierrez Jr. We've brought up before that Zach was in a custody battle, and it appeared he was compiling evidence to use in court. This makes sense that the main folder was labeled Kids, and then the folder with Rosalio's name was inside of that. The detectives found a folder with several photos of Rosalio and screenshots from Facebook. He said that most were placed there around April 25th, the night after Zach was accused of obtaining Rosalio's name from the license plate search. These photos would have been available on a public platform and is much different than sneaking in bushes and taking photos of people without their knowledge or consent, which none of that sort were found on Zach's computer or phone. Approximately 36 audio and video files were also found on this folder, but the detective said he did not listen to all of them. He said there were over 10 hours worth. He said it appeared to be a man and a woman arguing, presumably Zach and Sadie. We would hear short clips of carefully selected sections of these in trial, but the vast majority in context was not shown. If Zach had these in that folder he was using for his custody case, perhaps there was more information in those calls that could have been relevant. Without hearing the full clips, we have no idea what was said or why they may have been in there. Also found was a photo of a GPS tracking device.
Case Exhibit 31. Can you tell me what this is in relation to your review of the MSI laptop?
There's a picture of a GPS tracking device I found downloaded.
And where did you find this downloaded on that laptop, if you can recall?
Could have been in that kid's or Rosalio Gutierrez folder.
Detective Morton said that it was found during the download of the hard drive, and then that the report would have been sent to Discovery for the prosecution and defense to review. However, this photo was notably missing from the report received by the defense. Zach's attorney said she had never seen that photo. Morton reviewed her file on the stand and did not see it.
You're saying you don't see that image in this report?
The report files don't seem to be complete. So
Okay.
The actual main page of the report's there, but all the supporting folders that would contain the image aren't in here.
Okay. Judge, can we have a sidebar, please?
The jury was removed while Nicole brings up that this photo of the tracking device was not included in the hard drive provided by the state.
The report that basically Exhibit 31 is a screenshot of a tracker that the state and the witness have purported and testified to that was in the folder titled Rosalio, and that photo was in the report. I had never seen that photo before, not included in the report that I have. I had a hard drive from the state, which is here, that contained all of the downloads of the devices in this case. With this witness, I pulled up that report. The witness went through it and just testified that it's not a complete report. This photo cannot be located, the contents of that folder cannot be located in this report that I had. So obviously the defense has an issue now where we are not given a full report. That information I've never had before. I had asked the state where that was located because I couldn't find it prior to today's date. I thought I'd be able to clear things up with this officer or detective, pardon me. And clearly I can't because the defense was never given the full report. So I'd be asking for the full report to be able to go through it, or alternatively, strike all this testimony.
When Nicole brings this up to the judge is hesitant and mentions that they were supposed to be done with this case at this point. In referring to the missing photo, his response is, "It will probably pop up." Regardless of where that photo was, if Zach's defense team did not have access to it, it is a violation of Zach's Brady rights. The Brady Rule, named after the court case Brady v. Maryland, requires prosecutors to disclose material, exculpatory information in the government's possession to the defense. There's a lot of questions we have about this report of things found on Zach's computer, but more specifically about this GPS tracker. Was it possible that this photo was not in the original download report and added in later? This could explain why it's missing from Nicole's file. But we also discussed that Zach had spoken to his brother Solomon about purchasing trackers to use for Solomon's business. What if this photo was on his computer for a different purpose and not tied to the kids' folder or Rosalio's folder? This could also explain why it could not be found by Nicole in that file. Was this another attempt by the prosecution to mislead? In order for the tracker to be used as evidence of stalking, they would need to tie it to Rosalio, even if the photo existed elsewhere on the computer. Remember, no tracker was ever found by Sadie, and there was no evidence Zach used them at all, especially since one was found still in its original packaging at Zach's home. If he was going to use the tracker to stalk, why would he take it out of the packaging and take a picture of it and put it in a file named after the victim? It literally sounds like a page from the playbook of dumbest criminals. So which is it? Is Zach this crazy mastermind that planned and achieved a perfect murder with no body or evidence, but would be so negligent with a tracker photo? It just doesn't fit. We've now seen where we have a Brady violation, but then we also have an instance where the prosecution tries to make the point that the defense could have tested certain items if they wanted to make their case, possibly trying to deflect off of their lack of investigation and testing. However, this statement reflects a shift in the burden. The burden to prove guilt rests on the prosecution alone. Therefore, it is their duty to provide the evidence to prove guilt, not the defense's duty to present evidence of innocence. The accused is supposed to be innocent unless proven guilty by the prosecution, and doesn't even have to present any kind of defense if they choose, since the burden is solely on the prosecution. Here's a clip of Nicole arguing her point on this.
Again, what the defense did or did not do is 100% not relevant in this trial. So for the state to try to say, oh, yep, now we may use this as an argument later, their only argument is that the defense could have had this tested and they chose not to. So then we're put in a really weird situation, Judge, where then it seems that one of us have to be called to talk about why we don't do that. And the state's saying that there's no authority to ban this type of questioning, that he's asked this hundreds of times. Well, perhaps the defense counsel has not been adamant about their appropriate objection when it comes to the shifting of a burden. Well, but regardless, there's also, and I stand that my objection is firmly rooted in law. I can find a case on the issue as far as burden shifting, requiring the defense to provide information to a jury. But I can also guarantee that there's no authority that allows the prosecutor to ask such questions that are completely irrelevant. Relevancy, as this court is well aware.
I don't know how you can say it's irrelevant when you have,
it's irrelevant.
From the get-go in this case, you've said the case has been improperly or under-investigated.
Sure. So what does me having to do something, how does that change the police investigation? Am I the police?
No.
Okay. So then I'm not accusing myself of doing something wrong. I'm attacking the police investigation. What I did or didn't do has absolutely zero impact on police conduct in their investigation in this case.
Well, the jury has been and will be instructed again that the burden of proof is entirely on the state.
But when the DA made this comment and insinuated to the jury that the defense could have tested evidence, he shifted that burden to them improperly. Zach was also advised by his attorneys to not testify. This is actually a very common practice going back to the burden of proof. Since the burden of proof rests on the state, the defendant does not need to take the stand and proclaim their innocence, since their innocence should be presumed unless evidence removes all doubt. Choosing to testify is entirely up to you. In fact, criminal defense attorneys usually don't want their clients giving testimony for many reasons. In doing more research on this topic, we found on the law office of Ned Burnett's website the following regarding this. Constitutional protections prevent you from being forced to testify. Although you may want to race to the stand to defend yourself, you might do more harm than good. You must remember that you are already deemed innocent unless the prosecution proves your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If the prosecution cannot do this, don't risk going to the stand and doing their job for them. Many of us fear public speaking. Imagine yourself talking in a public space with your future on the line, potentially saying the most important words you've ever spoken. In the room are jury members, alternates, the judge, court personnel, attorneys, and people in the gallery. How well equipped are you to handle that? It would be hard not to be defensive, nervous, stumble, or make mistakes. If this happens, the jury might not believe what you say. We would ask deliberate questions to help you tell your story during our examination. But the prosecution cross-examines you with questions intended to make you look guilty and untruthful. If you say something false, even by mistake, the prosecution may introduce documents and testimony to show what you've said isn't true. The prosecution may use members of law enforcement and experts who are experienced and trained in testifying in court. Deciding not to testify is usually about avoiding risk. You may want to eliminate the chances of making mistakes and not coming across as credible, especially given the burden is on the prosecution to prove their case. Therefore, a defendant choosing to not testify for whatever reason is their constitutional right and should not be held against them in any way. Here's Judge Schroeder explaining that.
If you decide you do not wish to testify, then there'll be no cross-examination. You won't be questioned about anything about this case. And you would have the option for me to instruct the jury that your silence must not be considered in any way. Defendant in a criminal case has an absolute constitutional right not to testify, and his silence must not be considered as evidence against him in any way, or be considered in any way by the jury in deliberating on their verdict.
Yet many commentators would mention Zach's decision to not testify as a reason he must have been guilty. I can't tell you how many people say, I would want to take the stand to proclaim my innocence. While it's understandable, and I'm sure many of us feel that way, it's a very naive way of thinking. Prosecutors are highly trained attorneys. Their goal is to convict you, and they know exactly how to trip you up on your words and put a spin and different context on your testimony. Considering the prosecution has a burden of proof, you do not need to proclaim your innocence. What you may unintentionally do is give them an opportunity to make you look bad. Your proclamation of innocence is made with how you plead, whether you plead guilty or not guilty. And honestly, some witnesses are just unlikable. A jury may develop a bias against a person just because they personally don't like them. We've already seen that many people developed a bias against Zach just based on his hairstyle. It seems that Zach wanted to testify, but he chose to follow the advice of his lawyers and used his Fifth Amendment right. But despite all the reasons we provided on why it shouldn't have held any weight, it would still be a big talking point for those looking for support for their perceptions of guilt. But this rhetoric is harmful to our constitutional rights as citizens. Here's a clip of Zach's brother Solomon.
This idea that a man that maintains his silence is guilty of a crime is not how the legal system works. A man that chose to believe that the police aren't there to help him and that they're just trying to frame him for something that he didn't do has a right to silence.
During the trial, there was an instance where DA Gravely specified he wanted to get as close to the line as possible, that line being Zach's Fifth Amendment rights. Back when Zach was interviewed by police, at one point he asked for his lawyer, which ended the interrogation. Gravely wanted to ask the detective on the stand what questions he did not answer to. Why else would this be pertinent, except to allude that the questions he did not answer were indicators to guilt, or to assert that Zach was guilty through his silence in requesting a lawyer?
So I intend to ask about the contents of the hour and 29-minute interview that occurred between the defendant and the two detectives. I would like to be able to ask the detective whether there were additional questions that the detective did not have the opportunity to ask during that interview.
And
let me
sorry.
finish. I'm almost done.
Sorry.
And then also, were there any other opportunities to interview the defendant? So I don't intend to go any further than that. But again, we're talking about this avenue of what was the investigation. Certainly an hour and 29-minute video or interview does not, as the court is well aware from its long experience, is not an amount of time to cover all topics that would be necessary. I don't intend to go any further with it, but I believe that is the line, and I'm asking the court if I have permission to go that far and no further.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Judge. Asking why there were other questions that should have been asked that weren't, and then that they weren't able to have the opportunity to question him again is encroaching on the fact that my client asked for a lawyer, and that was why the interrogation concluded. So asking those questions, implying that there's more and that my client chose not to speak, is directly going towards his right to remain silent at that point.
We would see this attempt to cross the line of Zach's Fifth Amendment rights in D.A. Gravely's closing arguments by saying that if Zach was a wrongly accused man, then he had the opportunity to clear himself to police when questioned, and he didn't. But Zach had the right to silence and to choose what he shared with police, and that was protected under his Fifth Amendment right. Here's one of Zach's attorneys, Kirk Aubert, discussing this during the closing argument for the defense.
Mr. Gravely's right. He concluded with the fact that the burden of proof remains at this table at all times for each and every element of all the offenses charged. It never shifts to the defense. And some of his comments actually did talk about, why didn't the defendant do this? Why didn't the defendant do that? It's the state's obligation to present all of the evidence, both the burden of production and the burden of persuasion. In fact, it's been said, it was said at the beginning of this case, the defense doesn't need to call any witnesses. The defense doesn't need to say a word. And if the state does not carry its burden of proof, the only correct legal answer is not guilty.
Back to Gravely's closing. His theme would revolve around Zach having to be the most unlucky person if he truly was wrongfully accused. But his closing was not based on facts. It was based purely on speculation and theories. Just count how many times he uses the word maybe in this closing argument.
Like, maybe this is, and maybe get a light. This guy might be, maybe they just, maybe they don't know if you're, maybe, maybe you, Now, maybe you can't do, maybe you find, so maybe you are, and so maybe you didn't, maybe, in fact, you might have a situation. So you might even blame, you might even need to, so maybe you take things, maybe.
If you are trying to sell your case as to remove all reasonable doubt, how can you do this when you use possibility words such as maybe? That's not all. Gravely even errantly stated that Rosalio's body was found.
So, Rosalio Gutierrez is murdered on May 17th, 2020. His body's found on May 19th, 2020. Okay?
Rosalio's body has never been found, and while it's likely Gravely just misspoke here, how do we know that the jury didn't come away with that belief? We saw several people say that Gravely's closing arguments are what sold them in Zach's guilt, but this is incredibly problematic. The closing arguments are not evidence. The lawyer can reference evidence, but mostly what Gravely did was tie all the circumstantial evidence into a nicely packaged story. But the story he concocted was not evidence, it was a theory. While it may be influential and it may even sound likely to some people, likely and probably are not enough to convict someone. At least they aren't supposed to be. Gravely's entire closing argument was full of reasonable doubt just in the language he used. Had the defense been allowed, they probably could have concocted a nicely packaged story revolving around any of the other possible suspects that went uninvestigated. However, the jury seemed to come away buying the narrative presented by the state. After a nearly month-long trial, the jury deliberated for 10 hours. The only question the jury asked revolved around the photos found on Zach's computer, given the appearance that they were weighing the stalking charges more than murder charges. Back to our theory that if the state could prove stalking charges, then they would have their motive for murder. Did the jury only weigh whether Zach had a motive? Did they not weigh the opportunity aspect and ask themselves how a man was able to remove a large body by himself in a busy apartment building with no witnesses in a tight timeline and make it disappear without a trace? Some of the legal commentators who followed the case thought at maximum that the jury might have found him guilty of one of the stalking charges, even though that was very questionable and had reasonable doubt on its own. But they were not expecting that Zach would be found guilty on all charges. 1 count of stalking Sadie, 1 count of stalking Rosalio, intentional homicide, and hiding a corpse. Zach remained stoic during the reading of the verdict. We saw comments from people saying that because he didn't cry, he must have been guilty. But I couldn't help but notice the pain in his eyes. It had been 3 grueling years dealing with a system that felt like it was railroading him. Just because he didn't break down and cry should have had no bearing. Everyone reacts differently, but this would just be another way the media and those in the guilty camp would justify their guilty verdict. Maybe you started listening to this podcast and thought Zach was guilty. I do hope we were able to present some reasonable doubt for you to consider, as we've been open about our position from the start. If you aren't completely sure of someone's guilt based on the evidence that you are convicting the right person, the verdict should be not guilty. The feelings of guilt need to be tied to the evidence and not emotions, feelings, intuition, speculation, or personal biases. You can even think someone probably did it or might have done it, but still render a not guilty verdict because you aren't willing to gamble someone's life when you have a sliver of doubt. Benjamin Franklin said it more eloquently. It is better 100 guilty persons should escape than 1 innocent person should suffer. If I haven't changed your mind, I thank you for listening along with us anyway. At Zach's sentencing hearing, victims gave impact statements, including Sadie, OA, and Rosalio's mother. These statements could be used by the judge to weigh when determining the sentence, but when it was the defense's opportunity, the judge barred any of the family from reading their statements in defense of their brother and in support of his character. His attorney said the following in response.
And I will speak at length of Mr. Anderson's character as I know it, as over the last 3 years, I've gotten to know a very different side of Mr. Anderson than which was presented during the trial in this case. It's very easy to point out the negative characteristics of someone and to address the negative characteristics of an individual when that's all that's been presented. As the court's well aware, there are numerous rules of evidence that prevent certain types of things from coming in at a trial. Things that show the good side of Mr. Anderson, the good memories that people have, and the positive things in his life.
You know, I don't want to unnecessarily elongate this, but I have made exceptions. When someone offers me something about, well, 2 years ago he was walking down the street and there was a building that was on fire, and at risk of his own life he went in and rescued a whole family. That's something I would certainly want to hear about.
And I understand that, Judge. I wasn't speaking about Mr. Solomon. I was simply just presenting the defense's position on sentencing. Well,
I certainly don't mean to cut you off.
I think it's important, and just to premise, because I do felt cut off, and I do feel like the court does not want to hear about Mr. Anderson's character as we see it and as I'm allowed to present it. But I would like to continue on talking about Mr. Anderson. This is the sentencing for Mr. Anderson, as the Supreme Court in this state has made it very clear that pursuant to Gallion and McCleary, that a sentence, regardless of what the crime is, has to be individualized, has to be for the man who is sitting to the left of me. And if I can't speak to who that man is, I don't think this court can sentence him pursuant to that. If I can continue, I would really appreciate that, Judge. As I was saying, it's quite easy to focus on the negative aspect of someone when that's all that's been introduced.
As you probably noticed, her statement would be cut off by the judge in the middle, much like her opening statement was cut off by the DA. While unable to give his statement in court, Zach's brother Solomon later shared his statement on a YouTube stream.
Our family wants to extend our deepest condolences and our empathy to Rosalia Gutierrez's children, family, and loved ones. They didn't ask for this situation. They're victims of a heinous crime. However, Zach is innocent of this crime, and now he's a statistic. According to the National Registry of Exoneration, 2 to 10% of convictions are wrongful. An estimated 230,000 inmates in the prison system are innocent, and exonerated innocent people have served over 25,000 years in our correctional system as of June of 2021. My brother is a good man, albeit not a perfect man, but good nonetheless. He's always prioritized his family before himself. He got me my first job outside of working on a farm, the local our tree farm actually, and he drove me to work and home from work for every shift, regardless of whether or not it was sleeting, snowing, or he was puking his brains out. He taught me to drive, and he took me to the gym when I was young, and he taught me to work on myself and my self-confidence, even work through my own shyness and anxiety. He was always there for me to support me, advise me, or be my devil's advocate, just to make sure that I was thinking of things thoroughly. Zach has always been drawn to people that never had a fair chance at success in life or were downtrodden by the system. He rented his income properties out to people who were disenfranchised at below market values so he could help them recenter their life and get ahead when they were behind. That included Sadie. He made sure that the inheritance that she received from her mother's death was preserved for her to have in the future.
While Zach did not testify in trial, he was able to speak at his sentencing. Here's a clip of what Zach had to say.
I don't think that things played out fairly. I think that there's some things that are not just from our side, questions outstanding for both sides. And I don't think the court accomplished what it set out to do in any means if both sides are left with so many questions. And I don't think, without going into the case, I don't think we really got to the heart of the matter. What I can tell you is, I didn't kill anybody. What I can tell you is, I didn't stalk anybody. And what I can tell you is, I didn't dispose of any corpse. It's really weird to be sentenced for or convicted for it and soon to be sentenced for it, but I didn't, Judge. It kind of feels like there's no turning around on that now. I don't really know how to make a better statement of my opposition, but I disagree. I'm innocent. I don't know what you're going to decide. I don't know what you're all going to weigh. I don't even know how to represent my own character without having my family be able to testify on my behalf. But they do have some things that are relevant. I mean, even during the trial, there was a gentleman who tried to come up and talk to me. I think there was a comment about how now everything has happened during the trial. When he made that attempt, nobody really knew who he was. And I do know who he is. He's a man who I saved from assault in jail. He's actually related to one of the jailers. And my heart went out to him because I know he appeared inebriated, and I know he struggles. And I know he was coming up here to talk to me because we got along so good. But those tiny little moments throughout somebody's life, nobody accounts for those. But what they do a really good job of is making up all of these things that they want you to believe when they can label you as a monster. I don't really know what this is, but I didn't do it. I'm innocent, Judge. Not guilty. I'm innocent.
Zach is currently sentenced to serve 50 years in prison before he is eligible for parole. The trial was followed closely on YouTube by several channels, many of whom are practicing attorneys, work in the legal field, or are law nerds, collectively known as LawTube, residing all around the world from Michigan to Denmark, from California to Sweden, from Australia to Wales to Korea. The shock was palpable when the guilty verdict was read. The following are statements from some of the LawTubers giving their unique perspective on this decision.
30 years of being a lawyer, I've never seen a conviction on less or non-existent evidence. I've never seen a case convicted with more contradiction and contradictory witnesses. If you watch the verdict, on the panel I was on at the time, you'll see that we were all stunned into silence for several seconds because we were all flabbergasted that we thought this was a slam dunk acquittal. We were shocked by the fact that they came back with a guilty verdict in this case.
Having watched the Anderson trial from start to finish, I fully expected that he was going to be acquitted of the murder charge. In my opinion, the evidence against him was circumstantial at best, and there was no body. I'm still not 100% convinced that Gutierrez is dead. That's leaving aside my opinion on the alleged prosecutorial misconduct and some of the judge's rulings. When that guilty verdict came down, I was personally quite shocked. It was very clearly a miscarriage of justice.
It's a bunch of us watching it, and the majority of people, and myself included, thought this is a slam dunk, easy, not guilty for murder. What I will say was that a few people, myself included, weren't sure about the stalking element. The way they portrayed Zach was that he was some crazed monster. He was obsessed with Sadie, is how he came across. So I could see why the jury might need some time to deliberate on the stalking element. So when it came back and the verdict came back, I was very confident it was not guilty. Then Jesus wept when that guilty verdict was read for murder. I was like, whoa, WTF is going on here? It makes no sense. What have they seen that we haven't?
The way I felt when the guilty verdict came back, it's hard to explain how sad I felt. Because the way the case were presented, he should never have been found guilty.
The Zachariah Anderson case is a scary prospect. The idea that he can be convicted with essentially no evidence should scare everyone.
It was very clear to me that there was reasonable doubt. It was very clear to me from the evidence that Zach had to be innocent. There were numerous logistical factors that made it impossible for him to have committed any crime against Rosalio, including the fact that his DNA was found nowhere on the crime scene. How do you go to somebody's apartment, break in, cause enough blood loss to allegedly kill them, and then leave none of your DNA anywhere, no evidence, nothing? That was particularly odd to me.
You have no cell phone data that places him at the time and location. You have no eyewitness that placed anybody, let alone Zach, at the time and location.
I also could not fathom how somebody could drive to somebody's house and not have their car get picked up on any of the cameras that were on the way to that location. That made no sense.
You have no body. You have no DNA of the victim anywhere around or near Zach's apartment or a tree farm or anything like that.
Well, hang on, but there's blood. How did the blood get into the van? And we were like, well, is it blood? There's a big question mark there. They've not proved it beyond a reasonable doubt. There's nothing showing that it could be touch DNA, whatever, you know.
Let's add the DNA as one perspective piece of circumstantial evidence. So let's, for the sake of argument, assume that the DNA found in Zach's vehicle 100% matches Rosalio Gutierrez. We have explanation as to why one speck of touch DNA could have gotten there. Sadie was around. Rosalio Gutierrez could have transferred it to something that the kids touched or Zach touched in the home, because Zach would go in the home. You literally have no evidence at all, except for one speck of DNA that we're assuming, for the sake of this, is 100% Rosalio's DNA, which it's not.
I have a law degree. I am trained in evidence evaluation, in evaluating witnesses, and for me, the credibility of the witnesses against Zach was low, especially the prison snitch. I mean, that alone should never have been presented in court, in my opinion.
The prosecution was very unprofessional, highly unethical, and very shady in the way they handled their witnesses, handled their evidence introduction or failure to introduce evidence. The judge dropped the ball repeatedly by either making what I consider to be incorrect rulings, or in most cases not making rulings at all. Saying, we'll hold this off for later, we'll wait to see what happens down the road. The judge's duty is to judge, and that duty was failed.
The state acted during that entire trial should not be allowed in any criminal court anywhere in the world. You have a DA who made himself a witness in the case, a judge who clearly lost his touch and didn't even care for witness impact statements from the family. This case made me distrust the justice system in the US because the evidence presented didn't line up with a guilty verdict. The people who took the stand clearly either was coached, made a deal, or straight up lied. And it was just allowed to go in as evidence. I felt so disheartened when I heard the guilty verdict. This young man shouldn't be sitting where he's sitting today. Even gravely admitted during his closing arguments, there was tons of reasonable doubt. Sadly, the jury convicted him.
By the time the state was done with their case in chief, I thought this was the perfect case to be tossed by the judge as a directed verdict. There was simply no evidence. The only time a directed verdict should not be granted is when there's actual evidence that could be weighed by the jury and interpreted to find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Not only was there not enough evidence to find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, there was no evidence. There was speculation. There was assumptions. There was a could-have-beens all over the place. It could have been a lot of things, but you didn't prove what you were trying to prove, which was that Zach was guilty of unaliving and hiding a corpse. There's no rational basis for the jury to have concluded that Zach is guilty of murder or hiding of a corpse of Rosalio Gutierrez.
Following the streaming of the trial, many walked away feeling like they had witnessed a great injustice. A group was formed on Facebook by Zach's family, Free Zachariah Anderson. Together, with the help of law tubers who interviewed Zach's brother Solomon, the Andersons' goal was to raise awareness about Zach's case and raise money for his appeal. They also created a website, freezachariahanderson.org, where they uploaded case evidence, timelines, and information on how to help. To date, the group has 1.3 thousand members and has been working to raise funds needed for Zach's appeal. Unfortunately, the cost of appeals is very high and there is a waiting game. Many appeals can take years. As we said from the very beginning in our coverage provided, we watched this trial with no ties to anyone, no preconceived notions, but only looked at the evidence. We weren't convinced. So much so that we couldn't just move on with our lives. Before Zach's case, I had heard of wrongful convictions before, and even listened to a few podcasts on them. But if I'm being honest, I really didn't think too much about them. I guess most people tend to think it's not really their problem. They want to trust that the system will figure it out. But this case was so egregious that we couldn't just ignore what we witnessed. Our goal in sharing Zach's case is not just showing how one man's life was upended unfairly, but also showing how the system we trust with our lives and the lives of those we love is broken. Corruption exists, and it will continue to exist until we, the people, step in and demand change. It may not affect you today, but what happened to Zach could happen to you, to someone you love. Something needs to change, and we hope by sharing these wrongful convictions, we can make some kind of difference in bringing awareness to this problem in our justice system. This goes to the local officials we elect, how seriously we take our civic duty when assigned to a jury, and keeping these institutions accountable.
It speaks volume about how far away we are in the Western world, because this is not just in the United States. It happens in Europe as well, that you get convictions out of nothing. And I don't know what we can do about it, but keep raising the question, why does people get convicted on crap evidence? Just because, I don't know, people have the new, seem to believe that just the charges alone means somebody should be guilty. And that's not how, that's how you run a Sharia country, where the government says that person is guilty. This procedure is just symbolic. And we in the West need to get away from that. It's innocent unless proven guilty is the foundation we lay on in the United States and in Europe. That should be worth protecting.
The state and the federal government literally and figuratively have the power to take away our lives, whether it's through a life sentence without the possibility of parole, or whether it's literally through killing us by the death penalty. And if the government is going to try to take away our lives, they should only be allowed to do that on a fair, equal, legal, well-founded, evidentiary basis, and not through anything like we saw in this case.
For me, I was disgruntled after it. I literally stopped watching trials for a little bit because I could not believe that injustice like that can happen. So the injustice that Zach has gone through, it should scare people. And those that think he's still guilty, go and take a look at everything that's going on the ZachariahAnderson.org site. Listen to these podcasts, because Jesus wept. This could be your loved ones.
So when the verdict came in and when they read that guilty verdict out loud, it changed me. It had a really strong effect on me. I was very upset. I was very confused. I didn't understand how the jury came to that conclusion. And it took a long time for me to really realize and understand just how heavy the corruption was in this case. Zach's story is just one of many. There are lots of other people out there who have been wrongfully convicted.
It will keep happening until enough people say, we have enough. We've had enough. Hopefully, that will come sooner than later.
I really hope that he finds justice, and I will do anything in my power to contribute to a positive outcome.
And I hope this fight for Mr. Zachariah Anderson's freedom is one of the things that can turn this ship around, so we can return to a justice system worth protecting.
All we can do is hope that we can change enough hearts and minds, we can raise enough funds that he can have his appeal, so he can have this injustice overturned. I feel so bad, I feel so sad, and I hope that someday the real killer will be found and this man will be let free. Free Zachariah Anderson.
Free Zachariah Anderson.
Free Zach.
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 Free Zach.
Free Zachariah Anderson.
Free Zach.
Free Zachariah Anderson.
Free Zach. Free Zachariah Anderson.
Free Zach.
Free Zachariah Anderson.
Free Zachariah Anderson.
Free Zach.
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 Free Zachariah Anderson.
Free Zachariah Anderson.
Free Zach.
Free Zachariah Anderson.
Free Zach.
Free Zachariah Anderson.
If you feel moved by Zach's case and would like to help or learn more, please visit the website freezachariahanderson.org. This site holds a plethora of information on the case. There is also a section where you can help. Any donation amount helps and is appreciated and goes directly to his appeal cost. They also have merch for sale, such as apparel, mugs, and much more. If you aren't able to contribute financially, there are other ways to help outlined on their site, like writing letters to government officials. You can join their Facebook group as well to stay informed on updates. Also, one of the best ways to help is to spread the word. A big thank you to the YouTubers featured in our episode today: The Broken Baker, Aussie Overlord, Legal Vices, MLS Making Law Simple, Nicholas Starro Trial Watch, Remy Law, and The Alternate Corner. If you like following trials, make sure to give them a follow for fantastic legal coverage and commentary. I also want to take a moment to thank and acknowledge all of the people who make Wrongful possible. Alicia, our scriptwriter, Ashley, our social media person, and Kayla, who does our advertising and marketing. And I'm Josie, the voice behind Wrongful. While this episode was the conclusion of our retelling of the Zachariah Anderson case, it's not over. Stay tuned for updates and an episode response to what was portrayed on Killer Cases and Behind the Crime. What did they get wrong? What did they leave out? Find out soon.